his hand closed around her wrist like a trap snapping shut. Not a brush, not an accident, deliberate, punishing, the kind that leaves marks. The entire restaurant saw it. The other customers, the busboys, the hostess frozen near the podium. They all saw it, and not one person moved. Talia Mercer stood there, a tray of water glasses balanced in her other hand, her jaw tight, her eyes steady. 27 years old, Marine veteran, a woman who had survived things this drunk in a $500 shirt could never imagine. He leaned in close and said something that made the couple at the next table look away in shame. And then, in less than 2 seconds, everything in that restaurant changed forever. If you were sitting at one of those tables tonight, watching this happen to someone you loved, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this hit different for you, the kind where someone finally stops taking it and the world has to pay attention, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And drop a comment below telling me the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that restaurant, because nothing about this night goes the way anyone expects. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon. Not the dramatic kind that makes New York look like a movie. The other kind, cold, thin, relentless. The kind that soaks through your jacket before you realize it's happening and leaves you shivering on the subway platform, wondering where the day went. Little Italy on a Wednesday night in November wasn't exactly packed, but Carmine's Ristorante did a steady business regardless of weather or season. Red checkered tablecloths, candles and wine bottles coated with decades of hardened wax, old photographs on the walls showing men who had long since died smiling at cameras they didn't trust, the smell of garlic bread and cigarette smoke that had embedded itself so deep into the plaster that no amount of renovation would ever fully remove it. Talia Mercer had worked here for 11 months. She knew every creak in the floorboards between the kitchen and table 7. She knew which regulars tipped 20% and which ones tipped nothing and smiled like they were doing her a favor. She knew that the espresso machine in the back made a grinding sound at exactly the wrong moment and had learned to talk over it without missing a beat in her service. She was not happy here, but she was not supposed to be happy here. She was supposed to be here. There was a difference, and she understood it better than most people her age. Her shift started at 5. By 6:30, the place had filled to about 2/3 capacity, which was typical for a midweek evening. She was carrying 4 tables simultaneously. A couple celebrating something near the window, a family of 5 that had already sent back 1 order of pasta, an older gentleman eating alone with a library book propped against his water glass, and a corner booth near the back that had been occupied for the past hour by a single man who ordered 1 glass of still water and nothing else. She noticed the corner booth the moment she started her shift. Not because the man in it was particularly loud or demanding. He was the opposite. He sat with his back to the wall, always a tell, she'd learned in the Marines, and his eyes moved across the room with the kind of unhurried attention that most people in restaurants directed at their phones. He watched the room the way a person watches a chessboard, not looking for entertainment, looking for information. He had 2 men seated at a table nearby who were almost certainly not there for the linguine. Talia made note of all 3 of them, the way she made note of exits and service corridors, and the weight distribution of the trays she carried. Habit. Old training that never fully switched off, no matter how many months you spent serving tables in Lower Manhattan instead of doing the things you were once trained to do. She didn't approach the corner booth. She gave it space. The man in it hadn't asked for service, and something told her he'd ask when he was ready. At 7:15, table 3 arrived. There were 4 of them, 3 men and a woman, and Talia could read the dynamic before they sat down. Corporate dinner, expense account. One man doing most of the talking, which meant he was either the most important person at the table or the most insecure. The other 2 laughed at everything he said. The woman checked her phone. The man doing the talking was Gavin Rusk. She didn't know his name yet. She'd learn it later. At that moment, she knew only what she could observe. Mid-40s, custom suit, the particular brand of confidence that comes not from accomplishment, but from the repeated experience of never being told no. His face was already flushed when he sat down, which meant he'd been drinking before he arrived, which meant the next 2 hours were going to require patience she'd have to manufacture from scratch. She introduced herself and took their drink order. Gavin didn't look at her when she spoke. He kept talking to his colleagues, raising one finger in her direction as though flagging a taxi. She waited, wrote down the order when he eventually rattled it off without pausing his other conversation. She did not react. She had long since stopped expecting basic courtesy from men like him. Expectation was a luxury she couldn't afford on nights she needed her tips to cover Marcus's co-payment. Marcus, her brother, 23 years old. A cargo accident at the Brooklyn port 8 months ago had left him with a spinal injury that the insurance company had spent the better part of that time trying to reclassify as pre-existing. He couldn't walk without assistance. He couldn't work. He needed physical therapy 3 times a week that cost more per session than Talia made in a full shift, including tips. She was not complaining about any of this, not out loud, not to anyone. She was handling it the way she handled everything, quietly, methodically, with her feelings stored somewhere behind her sternum where they couldn't slow her down. The drinks came back. Talia delivered them. Gavin didn't look up. For the next 40 minutes, Table 3 ate, drank, laughed too loudly, and occupied a corner of the restaurant that seemed to generate its own weather system. 2 of the other tables shifted seats to put more distance between themselves and the noise. By the time the dessert course came around, Gavin had consumed enough wine to reclassify himself from merely unpleasant to actively unpredictable. Talia was delivering the tiramisu when it happened. She set the plates down carefully. The trick with tiramisu was that it looked stable and wasn't, and was reaching for the empty breadbasket when Gavin's hand shot out and closed around her wrist. Not a tap, not a brush, a grip. She felt the pressure immediately, deliberate, fingers pressing into the tendons above her pulse point. The kind of hold that was supposed to communicate something, ownership maybe, or the casual demonstration that he could, and that she would stand there and accept it. "Hey," his voice was thick. "I'm talking to you." She hadn't heard him say anything before grabbing her, but she didn't point that out. "Is there something wrong with your dessert, sir?" "You gave my client the wrong fork." He said it slowly, like she was having difficulty following. "You gave him the fish fork. This is tiramisu. You used the dessert fork." She looked at the fork in question. It was the correct fork. She had set the table herself. "I apologize for any confusion," she said. "I can bring a replacement if—" "I don't need a replacement." His grip tightened slightly. "I need you to pay attention when I'm speaking." He still hadn't released her wrist. The restaurant had gone quieter in the way restaurants go quiet when people pretend not to be watching something they are absolutely watching. The couple near the window had stopped eating. The family of 5 had gone very still. Even the older gentleman with his library book had looked up from his page. Talia's eyes moved once to the woman sitting across from Gavin. The woman was looking at her phone. She moved her eyes back to Gavin. "Sir," she said, her voice completely level, "please let go of my arm." He didn't. Instead, he leaned back slightly, tilting his chin up with the expression of a man who had decided to make this into something, a performance for his colleagues, maybe, or simply an exercise in the particular pleasure of watching someone absorb humiliation without fighting back. "You know, in a restaurant at this price point," he said conversationally, "you'd expect the staff to at least—" He didn't finish the sentence. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Talia set the tray down, not dropped it, set it, with the kind of muscle control that comes from 6 years of training your body to do exactly what you tell it to regardless of what your adrenaline is screaming. She turned her wrist inward against his thumb, which is the weakest point of any grip, and broke his hold cleanly. Then, before he could process that she'd moved at all, her other hand drove a short, controlled strike into the center of his sternum. Not a punch, not swinging, a drive. Heel of the palm, body weight behind it, precise. The air left Gavin Rusk's lungs all at once. He went backward off his chair. He took the table with him. Plates, glasses, the tiramisu. Everything came down in a cascade of noise that filled the entire restaurant for one suspended moment before silence crashed back in behind it. Gavin was on the floor among the wreckage of the table, gasping, his face cycling through colors she'd once seen described in a first aid manual. Nobody moved. The 2 men who had been laughing at everything he said were now staring at her with expressions she couldn't quite categorize. Somewhere between fear and the private satisfaction of watching something overdue finally happen. Talia straightened her uniform jacket. Her breathing was even. Her hands were steady. There was a faint ringing in her ears, which meant her heart rate had spiked, but her body was already bringing it back down. Old training, old discipline, doing its job without being asked. "Are you all right, sir?" "Sir?" she said. She was asking the man on the floor. She used the same tone she used when she asked if the pasta was satisfactory. Gavin opened his mouth. Nothing came out. At the corner booth near the back of the restaurant, the man who had been sitting alone all evening leaned forward slightly. His water glass was still full. His eyes, which had been moving across the room all night with the patience of someone reading a slow-developing situation, had now settled on Talia completely. He picked up the cigar that had been resting in a small glass tray beside his water. He lit it. He smiled. It was not the smile of a man who was entertained. It was the smile of a man who had just found something he had been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. His name was Dante Marcelli. I was 34 years old. He had inherited control of one of the most disciplined criminal organizations in New York at 26, after his father's stroke removed the previous structure of power in a single afternoon. In the 8 years since, he had rebuilt it according to his own methods that valued information over intimidation and strategy over brute demonstration. He was feared in this city, but rarely for the reason people assumed. Men feared Dante Marcelli not because he was violent. He was capable of violence, and the people who worked for him knew that, and that knowledge maintained a certain order. But what actually kept people cautious around him was something harder to name. He paid attention in a way that made people feel exposed. He remembered things. He noticed the details that everyone else filed under background noise. He had been sitting in this corner booth for over an hour, waiting for information about a betrayal inside his own organization, and he had spent that hour cataloging everything in the room with the particular focus of a man who had learned to read situations the way other people read text. He had noticed Talia Mercer within 4 minutes of arriving, not the way Gavin Rusk had noticed her, the opposite of that. Dante noticed things that didn't add up. Talia didn't add up. Not because anything was wrong with her, but because the picture she presented and the person she clearly was didn't match, and that gap was interesting to him the way gaps always were. She moved through a crowded space the way trained people moved, tracking without appearing to track, never putting her back fully to an entrance, carrying herself with a physical awareness that went well beyond the requirements of waiting tables. Her eyes didn't linger on anything long enough to be noticed, but they covered the room in a rotation that told him she was building and updating a mental map of it continuously. She was doing what he was doing. She was just doing it while also carrying tiramisu and manufacturing patience for a man who didn't deserve it. When Gavin's hand closed around her wrist, Dante had felt something tighten in his chest that he didn't examine too closely. He'd seen the grip. He'd calculated the trajectory of what was about to happen. Either she absorbs it and walks away, or something else happens. He had raised 2 fingers slightly toward the table where his guards sat. He lowered them again when she moved. He watched the whole 2 seconds of it with complete attention. The wrist break was technically clean, thumb side turn, efficient, no wasted motion. The strike was restrained, which told him she was capable of far more and had chosen exactly how much force to use. She hadn't tried to hurt him. She'd tried to stop him, and she'd succeeded. And she'd done it in a way that left him functional but adequately humiliated. That last part, he suspected, was intentional. He lit his cigar. He smiled. The restaurant erupted slowly back into sound. The scrape of chairs, the hiss of whispered conversations, the manager's voice rising near the front desk in the particular pitch of a man trying to decide whether he was witnessing something that required police or a form, or simply a very expensive apology to a customer currently sitting on his floor. The police question answered itself about 90 seconds later when someone at table 2 placed a call. Talia stood near the wreckage of table 3 and waited. She didn't run. She didn't look around for exits. She stood with her hands at her sides and waited for whatever came next, with the expression of someone who had made a calculation and accepted the cost of it before she moved. That, Dante thought, was the most interesting thing about her, not the strike. Anyone with training could throw a controlled strike. What was rare, what was genuinely rare in his experience, was that moment after, the willingness to own the outcome completely. No panic, no backpedaling, no performance of regret designed to soften the consequences. She had decided. She had acted. She was standing in the result. The manager appeared at her elbow. His voice was low, but Dante could read his mouth well enough. She was being let go. Effective immediately. Talia nodded. She untied her apron and set it on the nearest unoccupied table with the same care she'd used setting down the tray. Not angry, not dramatic, precise. She walked toward the back to collect her things. When she came out again, her jacket was on and she was carrying a small bag. She didn't look at Gavin, who was now sitting in a chair that someone had brought him, still working on getting his breathing fully under control. She didn't look at the manager. She walked toward the door and she pushed it open and she went out into the rain. Dante waited exactly 45 seconds. Then he stood, adjusted his jacket, said 3 words to the man at the nearby table without looking at him directly, and followed her out. She was standing under the awning with her arms crossed, not against the cold. Her posture wasn't defensive, it was contained. She was watching the street. She was already moving past what had just happened inside, cataloging options, running numbers. He could see it on her face. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and removed a plain black business card. No design, no logo. Just a name and a number, embossed in silver that caught the wet light from the street. He held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. She did not take it. "You just lost a job for doing the right thing," he said. His voice was conversational, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "That happens more than it should." She looked at him with the expression of someone waiting to hear the part that mattered. "You're wasting a valuable skill," he said. He kept his hand extended with the card. She looked at it again. Something moved behind her eyes. Recognition, calculation, the rapid internal assembly of implications that a person only performs when they already know enough to understand what a thing means. "I know who you are," she said. "Then you know the card is worth something," he said, "or worth the opposite." He didn't argue with that. He respected it. She looked at the card a moment longer. Then she reached out and took it. Not with hesitation, but not with eagerness either. She tucked it into her jacket pocket without looking at it again. She didn't shake his hand. She turned and walked into the rain. Dante stood under the awning and watched her go. He took a slow draw from his cigar. The smoke drifted sideways in the wet air and disappeared. Behind him, through the glass, he could see the restaurant slowly reassembling itself. The mess being cleared, the other customers pretending to return to their meals. Gavin Rusk talking loudly at someone on his phone, his face still carrying that particular shade of a man rearranging the story in his head to make himself the reasonable party. Dante looked away from him. He was not a man who gave his card to strangers. He had given it to 4 people in his entire career, and all 4 of them now occupied positions inside his organization that no one else could fill. He had a feeling, standing under that awning in the rain with the cold November air pulling the warmth from his collar, that he had just made the 5th. What he could not have known, what no calculation in his careful, disciplined mind could have prepared him for, was that she was going to be the only one of the 5 who would eventually force him to rethink everything he had built his power on. All of that was still ahead. Right now there was only the rain and the card in her pocket, and the particular certainty of a man who recognized something real when he finally saw it. He took one more draw from the cigar. He turned and walked back inside to wait for his information. The night was not finished with either of them yet. Dante walked back into Carmine's and the warmth hit him like a wall. Garlic, candle wax, the low murmur of a restaurant, pretending nothing had happened. He moved through it without looking at the tables, without acknowledging the stares that followed him back to his corner. He sat down. He set the cigar in the tray. He looked at his water glass. His phone was already vibrating. He picked it up. The text was from Caruso, his security chief. 4 words. Vane confirmed. Come home. Dante read it twice, set the phone face down on the table, picked up his water glass and drank half of it in one long pull, which was not something he typically did in public, and the fact that he did it now without thinking told him something about where his head was. Silas Vane had been with the Marcelli organization for 9 years. He had been with Dante personally for 6 of those. He knew the warehouse locations. He knew the rotation schedules. He knew the names of every legitimate business Dante used to process the organization's finances. And he knew which federal contacts Dante maintained at careful arm's length. And he knew, this was the part that sat like a stone behind Dante's sternum, he knew the names of the people who worked for Dante who were not criminals. The drivers, the building managers, the accountants who thought they were working for a real estate holding company. Because they were, except that the company had a second ledger they were never shown. Silas knew all of it. And for how long had he been feeding pieces of it across to Lorenzo Benedetti? Dante placed a 20 on the table. He always left cash, always left more than the bill. It was a habit formed early and maintained without exception. And he stood and walked out of Carmine's Ristorante for the second time that night. His car was at the curb. The driver, a quiet man named Fees, who had worked for the Marcelli family since before Dante was born, didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He read the set of Dante's shoulders getting into the back seat, and he pulled into traffic without a word. Dante sat in the dark of the car and looked out at the rain-slicked street and thought about Silas Vane's face the last time he'd seen it, 2 days ago. Tuesday morning briefing. Silas had sat across the table from him, right there in the conference room on the 14th floor of the building on Varick Street, and he had looked Dante in the eye and reported on territorial movement along the waterfront, and his voice had been steady, and his hands had been flat on the table, and Dante had looked at him and seen nothing. That bothered him more than the betrayal. He had missed it. He did not miss things. The car pulled into the underground garage beneath the Varick Street building at 9:47. Dante took the private elevator to the 14th floor. When the doors opened, Caruso was standing in the corridor with the expression of a man who had been rehearsing what to say and had decided none of his rehearsals were adequate. Caruso was 51, built like a man who had once been very large and had redistributed the weight over the years without losing any of the force behind it. He had a jaw like a shelf and eyes that were almost always half closed, which gave him the permanent appearance of someone who had heard every version of every story before and was waiting for you to get to the part that was new. "Tell me," Dante said, walking past him toward the conference room. Caruso fell into step. "Financial traces go back 8 months. Wire transfers through 3 shell entities, 2 of them registered in Delaware, 1 in Cyprus. Small amounts. Nothing that would flag a standard audit." He paused. "He's been careful. 8 months. At minimum. Could be longer. The first transfers we found were 8 months ago." Dante pushed open the conference room door. The table was covered with printed documents, laptop screens, 2 phones laid flat with messages visible. Another man was in the room, younger, narrow-faced, named Ellis, who handled Dante's financial intelligence. And he stood when Dante entered with the reflex of someone who was genuinely uncertain whether standing was the right call. "Sit down," Dante said. Ellis sat. Dante walked to the end of the table and looked at the documents without touching them. "Walk me through it." Ellis walked him through it. It took 12 minutes. It was meticulous, and it was damning, and it answered several questions Dante had been carrying for the better part of a year without knowing what the questions were. A shipment interference in March that had been attributed to Port Authority complications. A negotiation in July where the Benedettis had arrived, knowing leverage points they shouldn't have known. A surveillance operation in September that had turned up empty on a location that should have had product moving through it. Silas had been there for all 3. Silas had provided the explanations for all 3 that Dante had accepted. "Where is he now?" Dante said. "Apartment on Mulberry," Caruso said. "We have eyes on the building." "Is he moving?" "No, lights have been on since 8. He's home." Dante nodded slowly. He picked up one of the printed documents, a wire transfer record, numbers arranged in the particular dry language of financial crime, and looked at it without really seeing it. "Tell me about the Benedetti contact," he said. "Goes through a man named Pryor, mid-level. Works procurement for Lorenzo, which means he doesn't touch anything directly, but he moves information between people who do." Ellis cleared his throat. "The communication pattern suggests Silas wasn't giving them everything. He was giving them enough to be valuable without giving them enough to operate without him. He was managing his own leverage," Dante said. "Yes." Dante set the paper down. He planned to keep doing it. He wasn't burning an exit, he was building a position. Nobody in the room said anything. "He thought this was going to continue," Dante said. "Not a question. I was working it through out loud, which was something he rarely did, and the 2 men in the room were smart enough to stay quiet and let him do it. He thought I'd never find out, or he thought that if I found out, it would be too late for it to matter." He looked up. "Which means he's been watching my organization with the same attention I give to everyone else. He knows how I respond to betrayal. He knows my patterns." He paused. "He knows what I'll do next." Caruso said carefully, "That's why I'd recommend we move on him tonight, before he has time to—" "No." The word was flat, final, not raised. Caruso's jaw shifted. Dante. No. He looked at Caruso directly. If we move on Silas tonight, what do we have? One man gone and a gap in the Benedetti connection that Lorenzo fills within a week. He already knows we found Silas, or he will by morning. He turned back to the documents. We don't touch Silas yet. We watch him. We let him think he's still running his operation. And if he runs? Then we know exactly where he runs to. Caruso didn't argue further. He had worked with Dante long enough to know the difference between a position that could be moved and a wall. Ellis began closing laptops. Dante stayed at the table for another hour after both men left, going through documents page by page in the particular silence of a man doing the unpleasant work of cataloging exactly how badly he had been deceived and by how much. He didn't leave the office until 2 in the morning. He didn't sleep until 4. She called at 5:53. The phone vibrated on his nightstand, and he was awake before the second pulse. He'd always been a light sleeper, a fact he had never decided whether to be grateful for, and he looked at the number. Unknown. But it was the secondary phone, the one whose number was on the card he'd given out exactly 5 times in his career. He answered. Silence for a moment, then, "This is Talia Mercer." Her voice was different on the phone, flatter. The performance of patience had been removed, that careful service industry neutrality, and what was underneath it was something he hadn't expected. Not anger, not desperation, a kind of stripped-down directness that reminded him of the way soldiers sounded when they were done with preamble and needed to communicate something clearly. "I know who this is," he said. Another beat of silence. "I need to know if the offer was real or if it was something you say." It was real. What does the position actually involve? He sat up. Security, threat assessment, close protection logistics, some intelligence analysis, the kind of work that requires someone who can read a room and make fast decisions and doesn't rattle easily. "I saw you rattle one time," she said, while carrying tiramisu. It surprised him enough that he almost smiled. What changed between last night and now? The pause was longer this time. When she spoke again, the flatness in her voice had shifted slightly, just around the edges. "My brother's insurance appeal was denied. Final decision. I have until Friday to make a payment or his therapy gets suspended." She stopped. "That's it. That's why I'm calling. I'm not calling because I think you're a good person or because I'm excited about this. I'm calling because I'm out of options that don't include things I'm not willing to do." "How much?" She told him. "That's manageable," he said. "I'm not asking you to give it to me." "I understand that." "I'm asking what the salary is for the position you offered." He told her a number. She was quiet long enough that he wondered if the call had dropped. "That's more than I expected," she said. "The work is more than most people expect," he said, "and I need you to understand what the work actually is before you decide. I'll tell you everything, what my organization is, what it isn't, what I'm moving away from, and what I'm still in. I won't ask you to walk into something without knowing the shape of it. When? This morning, wherever you're comfortable." She named a coffee place in Park Slope. Public. Well lit. Her neighborhood, which meant she knew the exits. He noticed that. 9 o'clock, he said. 9 o'clock, she confirmed, and ended the call without saying goodbye, which he found he didn't mind at all. The coffee place was small and overheated and smelled like ground beans and someone's breakfast sandwich, and Dante arrived at 8:53 in a jacket and no tie, and ordered a black coffee at the counter and sat down at the table nearest the window. He kept his back to the wall. Old habit. Talia arrived at exactly 9. She came through the door and scanned the room in a single pass that took less than 2 seconds, found him, and crossed to the table without hesitation. She sat across from him. She was wearing dark jeans and a gray jacket, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked like someone who had slept about as much as he had, which was to say, not very much, but who had decided not to let that be visible in anything other than the slight tightness around her eyes. She didn't say hello. She put both hands flat on the table, not confrontational, just present, and looked at him. "Tell me the shape of it," she said. So he did. He spent 40 minutes being more honest with a stranger than he had been with most of the people in his organization. He told her about the criminal operations, the protection arrangements, the controlled movement of goods through ports he influenced, the financial structures that existed in the gray space between illegal and unprovable. He told her about what he was moving away from, deliberately, and why, and how far along that process was. He told her about the Benedetti situation without naming Silas, because that detail wasn't hers yet. He told her that the work she would be doing was real security work, not decoration, not performance, and that it would require her to be in rooms with people she would find contemptible, and to make decisions under pressure, and to maintain loyalty to an organization that was not fully clean and might never be fully clean. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She turned her coffee cup in a slow quarter circle. A habit, he noted. She did it when she was thinking. "You said you'd tell me what your organization isn't," she said. "You told me what it is. What is it not?" He looked at her. "It is not an organization that moves product that destroys people. No trafficking, no drugs. That was my father's prohibition, and it's mine, and it's the one thing I haven't bent on and won't." "Why should I believe that?" "You shouldn't," he said. "Not yet. People who tell you to trust them before they've earned it are people who need something from you they haven't said out loud. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to take the job, do the work, and watch whether what I told you matches what you see." She looked at him for a long moment. The coffee place made noise around them. The machine hissing, someone pushing back a chair, two women at the counter laughing about something on a phone screen. "I served 6 years," she said, "Marine security. The last 18 months of it, I was protecting people in positions of authority who used that authority the way Gavin Rusk used his hand last night." She paused. "I left because I got tired of putting my body between powerful men and consequences." "I know," he said. She looked at him sharply. "I had 12 hours, he said. "I used them. I know your service record, your discharge status, your brother's name and injury, and the insurance situation. I know you've been at Carmine's 11 months, and before that, you did contract security for a firm in Jersey City for 4 months, and before that, you were stateside trying to figure out what to do with yourself." He held her gaze. "I don't offer positions to people I haven't looked at. That's not surveillance. That's standard." Something moved through her expression, not quite anger, but related to it. "You could have told me that up front." "I could have," he agreed. "I'm telling you now." She looked at her coffee. "Marcus has nobody else," she said, and it came out quieter than everything else she'd said, the way things come out when they've been compressed for a long time and finally find a small exit. "He's 23 and he can't walk without a frame, and he's not complaining about any of it, which is worse than if he was. He just sits there and does his exercises and watches basketball and doesn't ask me how we're going to pay for the next month." She stopped. She looked back up. "I need this to be real." "It's real," Dante said. "If it stops being real, then you leave," he said. "I won't stop you and I won't send anyone after you. That's not how I operate and it's not in my interest. An unwilling person in a security role is a liability." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, "Okay, just that. No handshake." She pulled her jacket straight, picked up her coffee, and looked out the window at the street. "When do I start?" "Monday," he said. "I'll have someone send you the details today." She nodded. She stood to leave, and he said, "One more thing." She stopped. "There's a situation inside the organization right now. Someone I trusted who has been working against me. It's being handled, but it means you'll be coming in at a complicated moment." He looked at her directly. "I want you to know that before you walk in the door." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me?" "Because you asked me to be real," he said. She considered that. Then she nodded once, put her coffee cup down on the nearest empty table, and walked out. Dante sat alone at the table for a while. He drank his coffee. He thought about the word complicated and whether it was sufficient. It was not sufficient. Monday arrived. The Marcelli security headquarters occupied the top 2 floors of the Varick Street building, accessed by a keycard elevator that stopped at 13 first, a floor of empty offices maintained solely to discourage curiosity, before continuing to 14. The 14th floor looked like a corporate space that had been partially converted into something else. Clean desks, screens, a conference room with a glass wall that could be frosted at the touch of a switch. At the far end, behind a door that didn't have a handle on the outside, the actual operational center, Talia arrived at 8:45 on Monday, wearing the same dark jacket and carrying a bag that Dante's security team had scanned in the lobby with the particular professionalism of people who were used to people not liking it. She hadn't liked it, but she hadn't said anything. She had submitted to it with the expression of someone filing a mental note. Caruso met her in the elevator corridor and walked her through the floor. He was polite, he was professional. He told her where things were, what the protocols were, who she would be working with. He did not tell her what he thought about her being there, but he did not need to. It was visible in the precise neutrality of his voice, the way he answered every question directly and offered nothing extra. He thought she shouldn't be here. She absorbed it without confronting it. The room that mattered was the operational center, and she walked into it 20 minutes after arriving and found 7 people already there, variously occupied with screens and phones and documents, and all of them looked up when she entered with the uniform attention of people in a closed system registering the arrival of something new. Silas Vane was in the corner. She knew who he was. Dante had briefed her that morning, a 10-minute phone call, spare and precise, the facts laid out without drama. Silas, his role, the situation. What she was walking into, what she was supposed to do, which for the moment was nothing except learn the space and observe and not telegraph that she knew anything. Silas was 43, lean in a way that looked like he'd been constructed for efficiency rather than strength. He had a narrow, watchful face and hair going gray at the temples, and the particular bearing of a man who had been trusted for a long time and had learned to wear that trust-like clothing, effortlessly, until it wasn't. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds when she walked in, then looked back at his screen. The morning passed in controlled orientation. Caruso walked her through security protocols, shift structures, the monitoring systems. She asked precise technical questions and received precise technical answers, and by noon she had a solid map of how the operation functioned in its surface layer. At 12:15, Dante arrived on the floor. The room shifted slightly when he walked in. Not dramatically, not the way rooms shift when people are performing deference. More like a subtle recalibration, the way a group of people who have worked together long enough unconsciously orient themselves to the person around whom the operation centers. He walked to the operational center, greeted 3 people by name, reviewed a document Caruso handed him, and then looked at Talia. "How's the morning been?" "Informative," she said. He nodded. "Good." He looked at Caruso. "We have the Benedetti preliminary at 3. I want full coverage, tighter than usual." He paused. "Talia, you're in the room." She felt rather than heard the shift around her. It was the kind of shift that happens when a decision communicates more than the words carrying it do. Putting a newcomer in a room on her first day wasn't standard procedure, and everyone present understood that. Silas's chair moved slightly. A small adjustment, almost imperceptible. She noted it. "I understand," she said. Dante moved on to the next item. At 2:50, she was standing in the corridor outside the secondary conference room. Not the glass-walled one, the other one, windowless, the one they used for conversations that needed to stay in the building, when Silas appeared beside her. He didn't approach from the front. He came up on her left side, which put her at a slight angle, which was not accidental. "First day," he said. "First day," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man deciding how to say something he's already decided to say. "You know what this meeting is?" "Preliminary negotiation with a rival family on territorial boundaries," she said. "That's what I was told." That's one way to describe it. He smiled, and it didn't reach anything above his mouth. "What I'm saying is, this room isn't a place to learn. This room is a place where things go wrong. If you don't know the players and you don't know the history, you're a liability." He paused. "I'm telling you this as a professional courtesy." She looked at him directly. "I appreciate that." "Dante has a tendency," Silas continued, "to trust people before they've proven themselves. It's one of his, let's call it a characteristic." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm not saying that's what's happening here. I'm saying watch yourself in there." The door to the conference room opened. Caruso appeared, gestured them in. Talia walked past Silas without looking back at him. She sat in the assigned position, right side of the table, 2 seats from Dante, close enough to act if something moved but not positioned as a primary. The Benedetti representatives arrived 3 minutes late, which was itself information, either disrespect or a test, and she suspected both. There were 3 of them. A lawyer she didn't know, a man named Greer who operated as a logistics intermediary, and a larger man who sat at the back without speaking, and whose job was exactly what her job was, which meant she and he spent the better part of the meeting conducting their own parallel assessment of each other across the table. The negotiation was dense and careful, and conducted in a language that used the words business interests and mutual accommodation to describe things that were not those things. Dante led it with the same unhurried attention she had observed in the restaurant. He ceded nothing that wasn't already gone. He held every line that mattered. She focused on the room. At one point, Greer said something about the service corridor access to the waterfront building, and she noticed the very slight pause before Silas responded. A half second, the kind of gap that meant a decision was being made. And then Silas's answer, which was technically accurate and functionally misleading, and the way Greer's eyes moved to the tabletop for exactly 1 second after hearing it. They already knew. Silas had already told them. Greer's pause wasn't processing information. He was managing his reaction to confirmation of something he already possessed. She kept her face still. She kept her hands on the table. She filed it behind her eyes and let the meeting continue. Afterward, in the corridor, Dante walked beside her toward the elevator. "Talk to me," he said quietly. "Greer already had the service corridor information before Silas confirmed it," she said, equally quiet. The response pattern was management, not reception. He was controlling his reaction. Dante didn't respond immediately. They reached the elevator. He pressed the button and looked at the closed doors. "You caught that in your first meeting," he said. "It wasn't a question. I've spent a lot of time in rooms where people were pretending to receive things they already knew," she said. The elevator opened. They stepped in. "Silas briefed me this morning that the corridor detail was safe to share as a goodwill gesture," Dante said. "He told me it was information the Benedettis couldn't use offensively." She looked at him. "He told me that 2 days ago," Dante said, "so I told him the plan for Friday's shipment review included a secondary team at the corridor entrance." He paused. "I fabricated that detail. There is no secondary team." She understood. "So if the Benedettis move on the corridor Friday, then we know exactly how it got to them." The elevator reached 14. The doors opened. Neither of them moved for a moment. "He briefed you this morning," she said, "after the Benedetti meeting was already scheduled." "Yes. He knew you'd be watching his body language in the meeting. He needed to give you a reason to explain away anything you noticed." Dante looked at her. "That's what I think." "So he's smarter than he's been acting." "Or more desperate," Dante said. "Those look similar from the outside." They stepped out of the elevator. Across the floor, through the glass wall of the operational center, Silas was at his desk. He was looking at his screen. His posture was relaxed. He was too relaxed. Talia had been in enough forward environments to know what controlled performance looked like when someone was running it from the inside, when every muscle was doing a job and the job was appearing to do nothing. "He knows I noticed," she said. Dante followed her gaze. "How certain?" "The shoulder tells," she said. "Right side. He's been carrying it half an inch higher since the meeting ended. It's a stress response that doesn't root through conscious control." She paused. "He's trying to figure out what I saw and whether I told you yet." A long moment. "He's going to move," Dante said. "Yes," she said. "How soon?" She thought about the timing, the Friday shipment, the corridor, the Benedettis already in possession of information they were pretending to receive. Silas running calculations right now behind that careful blank expression. "He'll try to neutralize me before Friday," she said, "or go around me to Benedetti directly and accelerate whatever they were planning for the corridor." Dante was quiet. "Either way," she said, "you have less time than you thought." Dante nodded once, very slowly. He looked across the floor one more time at Silas. "Go home tonight," he said. "Don't take your usual route. Don't stop anywhere between here and your door. Lock it." She looked at him. "Is that the organization protecting an asset?" she said. "Or something else?" He looked back at her. Whatever was behind his eyes at that moment was complicated, and he didn't try to simplify it. "It's both," he said, "and I'd rather tell you that than pretend it's only one." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, picked up her bag, and walked toward the elevator. She took 3 different trains home. She checked her door before she touched the handle. Old habit, checking the thread she left across the bottom of the frame each morning, the one that fell if anyone passed through. It was intact. She went inside and locked the deadbolt and the secondary lock and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her phone and thought about Dante's face when he said it's both. She was still thinking about it when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She answered it. A voice she didn't know said, "Ms. Mercer, I was asked to give you a message from a mutual friend." A pause. "He said to tell you that the decision you made this week can still be unmade. There's a better offer on the table, one that doesn't require you to be standing next to Dante Marcelli when things go wrong." Her hand tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" she said. "Someone who knows what Friday looks like," the voice said, "and would rather you not be there when it happens." The line went dead. She sat with the phone in her hand and the locked door in front of her, and the quiet of the Brooklyn apartment pressing in from all sides, and she understood with complete clarity that she was no longer in a situation she could walk away from by simply deciding to walk away. She had been marked, not by Dante, by the people who wanted to know whose side she was on, and who were willing to make Friday very ugly if they didn't get their answer before then. She sat with the dead phone in her hand for a long time, not frozen, processing. There was a difference, and she had learned it the hard way in a forward operating base outside Fallujah when she was 22 years old and the convoy she was supposed to be protecting had taken fire from a direction her briefing said was clear, and she had approximately 4 seconds to decide between two options that both had serious problems, and she had chosen one of them and lived with the result. The result had been the right call. She had not always been certain of that in the years since. She set the phone on the nightstand. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below. A bodega still lit, a man walking a dog that was investigating a fire hydrant with great professional seriousness, a car going past with its radio audible for 2 seconds and then gone. Ordinary street, ordinary night. She turned away from it. The call had come from someone who knew her number. Her number was on a secondary phone she had purchased with cash 3 days ago, specifically so that only Dante's organization had it, which meant either the call came from inside that organization or it came from someone who had obtained the number from inside that organization within the past 72 hours. Silas. Had to be Silas. Which meant Silas had moved faster than she told Dante he would, and it meant he had done it before Friday, and it meant the Benedettis now had her number, and at least a partial read on what she was doing inside the Marcelli operation. She picked the phone back up and called Dante. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was awake, which meant he hadn't been sleeping any better than she had. "Someone just called me," she said. "Unknown number, male voice, probably 40s, educated. Said there was a better offer on the table and that I should not be standing next to you on Friday." A silence that lasted exactly long enough for her to know he was absorbing it rather than performing a reaction. "How long ago?" he said. 4 minutes. "Are you locked in?" "Yes." "Stay that way until I call you back." A pause. "Don't call anyone else. Don't answer numbers you don't recognize." "I know that," she said. "I know you know it," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." He ended the call. She sat back down on the edge of the bed. Marcus's door was closed across the hall. She could hear the faint sound of the television. He fell asleep with it on, had done it since they were kids. Some comfort channel habit formed during the years their mother worked night shifts and the apartment was too quiet without noise in it. She listened to the low murmur of it for a moment. Then she stood up, crossed the hall, and pushed his door open quietly. He was asleep. 23 years old, broad-shouldered, the physical frame he'd built before the accident still visible in his arms and chest. A cruelty particular to spinal injuries, that they could leave the architecture of a strong body intact while removing the wiring. His walker was folded against the wall beside his bed. His phone was on the pillow near his face. She looked at him for 10 seconds. Then she pulled his door almost shut and went back to her room and sat down with her back against the headboard and her knees up and her eyes on the door. She did not sleep. At 2 in the morning, Dante called back. "I need you here," he said. "Now." "What happened?" "Silas is gone." She was already off the bed. "Gone how?" "His apartment is empty. His car is at the curb. He left the car, which means he went somewhere he didn't want tracked through plates or tollway cameras." A pause. "He made 3 calls between 10 and midnight. 2 to numbers we can't trace without federal cooperation we don't have. 1 to a number registered to a shell company that Ellis has been watching for 6 weeks. Benedetti?" "Yes." She was pulling her jacket on one-handed, phone wedged between her ear and shoulder. "He accelerated." "He accelerated," Dante confirmed. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not panic, nothing that clean. Something colder. the sound of a man revising his understanding of a situation and not liking what the revision produced. He's been doing this longer than 8 months, Talia. Ellis found a second set of transfers, different routing, different entity structure. It goes back 2.5 years. She stopped moving. 2.5 years? She said. Yes. She thought about what that meant. Everything Silas had known 2.5 years ago, the organizational structure at that point, the contacts, the properties, the people. Dante, she said carefully, 2.5 years ago, what was your father's condition? A silence. He had the stroke 3 years ago, Dante said. He was in rehabilitation for the first year. During that year, I was running the organization, but the formal structure hadn't fully transferred. He stopped. Silas was functioning as operational lead, she said. Yes. So for 6 months to a year, Silas had full operational knowledge and independent authority, and no one above him running a parallel check. Yes. And he started feeding Benedetti information during that window. That's what the transfers suggest. She finished putting her jacket on. He didn't just betray you, she said. He built a parallel intelligence channel while he was the closest thing to in charge that your organization had. He's been running both sides for 2.5 years. The question isn't what he gave them. The question is what he built for them, using everything he had access to. She heard Dante breathe. It was not a sound she had expected from him, not dramatic, barely audible. The breath of a man who had just finished a calculation he would have preferred not to complete. There's a car outside your building, he said. Blue Accord, civilian plates. The driver's name is Watts. He's been with the family for 11 years, and his loyalty has been verified 3 times, including 48 hours ago. A pause. I wouldn't send him if I wasn't certain. I'll be down in 5 minutes, she said. She knocked on Marcus's door on her way past. He stirred. Talia? I have to go out, she said through the door. Work thing. Don't open the door for anyone and call me if anything feels wrong. A pause. You okay? Yes, she said. Go back to sleep. She went downstairs. The drive to Varick Street took 19 minutes at that hour. She sat in the back of the Accord and watched the streets go by and thought about 2.5 years and what a person could construct in that amount of time if they were patient and careful and trusted and already inside the walls. The elevator to 14 opened at 2:47 in the morning to a floor that looked nothing like it had during business hours. Half the lights were on. 4 people were at screens. Caruso was standing near the operational center door with a coffee he wasn't drinking. He looked at her when she came off the elevator with the expression of a man who had stopped deciding what he thought about her and moved on to more immediate problems. Conference room, he said. Dante was in the conference room. He was standing at the window, not looking out of it, just standing near it, the way people stand near windows when they need something to face that isn't a person. He had a phone in his hand and a jacket that looked like it had been put on quickly and a cut on his right hand that she hadn't seen before. She looked at the cut. What happened to your hand? He looked down at it like he'd forgotten it was there. Caruso's desk has a corner. He set the phone down on the table. I put my fist through a framed photograph about an hour ago. She noted that information carefully, not as a weakness, as a data point. He had lost his composure for a period of time before she arrived and had reestablished it, which meant she was seeing the result of the reconstruction rather than the original break. She filed that away. Tell me what Ellis found, she said, and sat down. He sat across from her. He spread 3 documents on the table between them and walked her through it. Not the way he'd walked her through it in the coffee shop, carefully and constructed, but faster, skipping the scaffolding, treating her like someone who could keep up with the unedited version. She could. The picture that emerged over the next 30 minutes was worse than what she had constructed in the car. Silas hadn't simply been feeding information to Lorenzo Benedetti. He had been building Lorenzo's organization's operational capability using Marcelli intelligence as the raw material. Shipping routes, warehouse access schedules, the names and habits of Dante's legitimate business contacts. All of it had been transferred in pieces small enough not to trigger internal review, assembled on the other side into a structural map of Marcelli operations detailed enough to plan a targeted takeover. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the personnel files. He exported them 14 months ago, Ellis said. He had appeared at the door during the briefing, laptop in hand, and had been allowed in. He was running on what appeared to be caffeine and the particular nervous energy of someone who had found something they wished they hadn't. Complete employee database. Names, addresses, family contacts, schedule patterns. Everyone from the operational staff to the building managers to the shipping coordinators. He set the laptop on the table. Including, he said, and paused in a way that suggested he understood the weight of what he was about to say, the names and addresses of immediate family members. The room was quiet. Talia looked at the screen. The file structure was visible, columns of names, addresses, relationship designations. She thought about Marcus asleep across the hall from her empty room. She thought about 3 different trains. She thought about the thread across her door. He gave them home addresses, she said. Yes, Ellis said. She looked at Dante. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table. The cut on his right hand had a small dark edge where it was beginning to close. How many people in this database have family members who don't know what the organization is, she said. Most of them, Caruso said from the doorway. He had come in at some point. Drivers, building staff, the restaurant crews, they think they work for legitimate businesses because they do. The businesses are legitimate. But their addresses are in a file that Lorenzo Benedetti has had for 14 months, she said. Nobody answered that because the answer was yes, and everyone in the room already knew it. She stood up. My brother's name is in that file, she said. It wasn't a question. You weren't in the organization 14 months ago, Dante said carefully. But you ran my background before you gave me the card. She looked at him directly. When did you run it? A beat. 10 days ago, he said, before the restaurant. And where does that background report live? The silence that followed was its own answer. Ellis, Dante said, without looking away from her. The background reports are in the same database structure, Ellis said. He sounded like he would have preferred not to say it. Standard integration. If Silas had access to the export function, and he did, he had administrative credentials, then anything added to the database in the past would have been included in his export. But she wasn't in the database 10 days ago, Dante said. No, Ellis said. But if he pulled a secondary export recently, check, Dante said. Ellis typed. The sound of it was very loud in the room. 17 seconds. There's a secondary export, Ellis said. 6 days ago. 6 days ago was the day after Dante gave her the card. Talia sat back down. She put both hands on the table. She looked at the surface of it, the grain of the wood, the faint ring left by someone's coffee cup, and she made herself breathe at the pace she wanted rather than the pace her body was suggesting. Marcus's address was in a file that Lorenzo Benedetti had received 6 days ago. The phone call tonight had not been a coincidence or a general warning. It had been precise. It had been targeted. Someone had looked at that file and identified the person she cared about who could not run, could not fight, could not protect himself, and they had made a calculation about what that meant. Change sides or your brother pays. She understood now that the phone call had been the polite version. I need to move my brother, she said. Her voice came out flat and controlled, and she was aware of exactly how much effort that was costing her. Tonight, right now. I have a secured property and... Dante started. No, she said. He stopped. Not a Marcelli property, she said. Somewhere Lorenzo Benedetti doesn't know about because Silas doesn't know about it. Dante looked at her. If Silas has been building Lorenzo's intelligence for 2.5 years, she said, then every property your organization controls is a property. Lorenzo has a file on. A safe house inside your network is not safe. Not tonight. Dante was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Caruso. The Hoboken property, Caruso said. Silas never had access to it. It's not in any organizational record. It's registered to my sister's married name, and I have been the only person who has ever had a key. Does your sister know about it? Talia said. She died 4 years ago, Caruso said. There was no invitation for condolence in his voice. I've maintained the registration. The utilities run on automatic payment from an account he wouldn't know to look for. She looked at him. For the first time since she'd walked in the door on Monday morning, she and Caruso were looking at each other without the careful professional neutrality that had characterized every previous exchange. Okay, she said. I'll drive you, Caruso said. We go now, she said, before it gets any lighter outside. Dante said, I'll have someone with you. I don't need someone with me, she said. I need my brother in a building Silas Vane has never heard of. That's what I need. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. It rang 4 times. 5, 6. Her hand tightened on the phone. 7. Talia. His voice was thick with sleep. What's... Wake up, she said. Get dressed. Pack what you need for a week. Don't go near the windows. A pause. She could hear him processing, the shift in his breathing as sleep fell away. I'm not scaring you. I'm being precise. We need to move. Talia, what's happening? I'll explain everything when I get there, she said. Can you be ready in 20 minutes? A beat. Then Marcus, 23 years old with a spinal injury and a walker he hated using, said, Yeah, okay, I'll be ready. She put the phone down. Dante was watching her. When this is resolved, he said carefully, I intend to compensate every person in that database for the risk. That's after, she said. I need to focus on before. She stood up and looked at him, and there was something in her expression that she didn't try to edit because there wasn't time for editing and he was going to see it anyway. Silas built a weapon using people who didn't know they were part of your organization, she said. Your drivers, your building managers, your restaurant crews. They think they have regular jobs. Now their home addresses are in a file that a man like Lorenzo Benedetti is holding. She stopped. You need to understand that before Friday, before whatever you're planning with the waterfront, those people are exposed, and they will stay exposed until this is over. Dante said nothing. I'm going to get my brother, she said, and then I'm coming back. And then we are going to figure out how to end this faster than you were planning to, because the timeline just changed. She turned and walked toward the door, and Caruso fell into step beside her, and they went to the elevator without speaking. It was in the elevator that she let herself feel, for approximately 8 seconds, what she had been not feeling since Ellis said 6 days ago. It moved through her chest like a current. Not panic, something rawer than panic, something that didn't have a clinical name. The specific terror of understanding that someone is using the person you love as a lever, and that the lever is in position and that all they are waiting for is the right moment to pull it. 8 seconds. The elevator reached the lobby. She put it back behind her sternum, where she kept the other things. The drive to Brooklyn took 14 minutes. She sat in the front seat. She always took the front seat, couldn't help it, needed to see the road. And Caruso drove without talking, which she appreciated, because everything she had to say was internal, and she needed the space to work through it. Marcus was waiting in the living room when she came through the door. He had his bag on the floor beside the walker, dressed in the dark jeans and net sweatshirt he defaulted to when comfort was more relevant than appearance. He looked at her face when she came in and read something there that he didn't comment on. "You're going to tell me what this is," he said. "Yes," she said. "On the way." She picked up his bag. He took a breath and picked up the walker, and they went out together. Her setting the pace to his, which was slower than she would have gone alone. And she did not rush him, not by 1 second, because the day she stopped adjusting her pace to her brother was the day she had actually lost something worth keeping. In the car, with Caruso driving and the Brooklyn streets going past in the gray pre-dawn, she told Marcus the shape of it. Not everything, the necessary parts. A man she worked for had an enemy who was willing to use people's families as pressure. She had taken a job that put her in the middle of that situation. Until it was resolved, he needed to be somewhere they couldn't find him. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The job you took. The one you said was security work." "Yes." "You knew going in it was complicated." "Yes." Another silence. "The guy you work for," Marcus said, "is he worth it?" She thought about the cut on Dante's hand and the way he had said, "It's both in the elevator and the 40 minutes in the coffee shop," where he had been honest with her in a way she hadn't fully expected and had still not fully processed. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm trying to find out." Marcus nodded slowly. He looked out the window. "Okay," he said. Just that. The same register she'd used when she agreed to the job. Family trait, maybe. Decisions made and then committed to without theatrical reinforcement. The Hoboken property was a third-floor apartment in a building that looked like every building on that block. Brick, functional, unremarkable. The kind of place that disappeared into the city. Caruso had a key. The apartment was furnished in the minimal way of spaces maintained rather than inhabited. A couch, a bed in the single bedroom, a kitchen with the basics. a television. She got Marcus settled. She showed him the locks, the fire escape route, the intercom procedure. She left him with 2 charged backup phones, both registered to names that weren't his, and the number for Caruso's secondary cell. At the door, she turned back. Marcus was sitting on the couch, Walker folded beside him, looking at the unfamiliar room with the expression of a person recalibrating to a new situation without complaint. She looked at him for a moment. "I'm going to fix this," she said. He looked at her. 23. Broken in ways that shouldn't be defined by it. "I know," he said. She went back downstairs. In the car, on the way back to Manhattan, with the sky beginning to turn the particular gray that happens before dawn. But after dark, Caruso said, "He's going to move on the warehouse before Friday. The phone call tonight wasn't a warning, it was positioning." "I know," she said. "If he moves before we're ready, I know." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You came in on Monday. This is Thursday morning." He kept his eyes on the road. "I didn't think you'd still be here by Thursday." She looked at him. "I wasn't sure you were the right call," he said. "It came out without apology and without particular softness. Just the fact of it, stated plainly. I've been watching Dante trust people and have it work and watching it fail, and the ratio is not what you'd want it to be." "And now?" she said. He thought about it. Actually thought about it. She could see him working through it, the jaw moving slightly the way it did when he was processing. "Now," he said, "I think Silas made a mistake making it personal." "Why?" "Because until tonight you were doing a job," Caruso said. "Now you're doing something else." She looked back at the road. He wasn't wrong. By the time they reached Varick Street, the sky was changing. She went back to 14 and found Dante still in the conference room, Ellis still at the laptop, 2 other people she didn't know filling in details on a large printed map of the waterfront district pinned to the wall. Dante looked at her when she came in. "Your brother's secure?" he said. "Yes?" "Good." He looked back at the map. "Then we have work to do." She stood in the doorway and looked at the map. The waterfront, the warehouse, the access corridors, the streets feeding into it. And she thought about the phone call and the personnel file and Marcus on the couch in a Hoboken apartment that smelled like someone else's absence. She thought about what Caruso had said. "Until tonight you were doing a job. Now you're doing something else." She walked into the room and stood beside Dante and looked at the map and said, "Walk me through Friday." And Dante looked at her. Not the look of a man assessing an asset, not quite, something more complicated than that. And he said, "Silas told the Benedettis that I'll be out of the city Friday night and the warehouse will be running reduced security. Will you be out of the city?" "No," he said. "I will not." She studied the map, the service corridor entrance, the loading dock, the 2 street approaches. "He'll bring people," she said. "Lorenzo doesn't do things himself." "No," Dante agreed. "He'll send a team. He'll want the warehouse neutralized and documented evidence of Marcelli vulnerability before he moves to formalize a takeover. And Silas will be with them," she said, "because he'll want to watch it happen." Dante said nothing. "You're not going to let them walk into an empty building," she said. "You're going to be there." "Yes." "With what?" "With you," he said, "if you're still willing, and with something Lorenzo Benedetti is not going to expect." She looked at him. Outside the windows of the 14th floor, Manhattan was beginning to resolve itself out of the dark. Outlines first, then shapes, the city assembling itself the way it did every morning, indifferent to what had happened in the night, prepared for whatever the next 24 hours required. She had come into this building on Monday as a woman out of options. She was still out of options. But the shape of the situation had changed, and with it something inside her that she had been keeping carefully managed since the Marines, since the convoy, since the years of protecting people who didn't deserve it. Something that was not anger exactly, but was adjacent to it. Something that had been waiting for a purpose worthy of the pressure it represented. She put her finger on the service corridor on the map. "This is where they come in," she said. "Yes," Dante said. "Then this is where we need to be," she said, and her voice came out with a steadiness that surprised even her. The particular steadiness of a person who has stopped calculating the cost of the decision and accepted it completely, and moved on to the work of making it count. The plan took shape between 3 in the morning and noon on Thursday. Talia didn't sleep. She didn't try. She had operated on no sleep before, had done it for stretches that would have broken people who hadn't been trained to understand that the body could continue past what the mind thought was the limit, that exhaustion was a wall you walked through rather than stopped at. She worked on coffee and the particular cold clarity that arrives when everything unnecessary has been burned away and only the essential remains. The warehouse was on the Hudson side, west of the main shipping corridor, a building that had been in legitimate use as a Marcelli storage and distribution facility for 11 years. 4 stories. Loading dock on the south face. Service corridor entrance on the east, running alongside the building from the street to a secondary door that opened into the ground floor operations area. Freight elevator, central stairwell, 2 interior fire doors on each floor. She walked it Thursday afternoon with Dante and Caruso and said almost nothing, just moved through the space with her eyes doing the work, building the 3-dimensional map she would need to operate in the dark. Because it would be dark. That was the decision. When Lorenzo's team arrived Friday night expecting a facility running reduced security, they would find a building that looked exactly like a facility running reduced security. Minimal external lighting. 1 vehicle in the lot. No visible perimeter. The dock doors closed and padlocked in the way that suggested routine rather than preparation. What they would not see. Dante positioned at the center of the ground floor, unarmed, which had been the most difficult conversation of the past 12 hours. "You're not going in there without a weapon," Caruso had said. He said it the way a man says something he knows won't land the way he needs it to, but has to say it anyway. "I'm going in there without a weapon because I need to be on camera without a weapon," Dante said. "If this ends in federal court, and it ends in federal court or it doesn't end cleanly, I need to be the man who walked into his own warehouse without a weapon and was surrounded. Not the man who brought a weapon to a confrontation and can be characterized as instigating. And if something goes wrong before the agents move," Dante looked at him. "That's what she's there for." Talia had said nothing during that exchange. She was looking at the building schematic. She was also registering that Dante had just placed his physical safety in her hands in front of his most trusted associate, which was either the greatest demonstration of trust she had ever been offered or the most dangerous position she had ever been put in, and she had not yet fully determined which. Probably both. The federal piece had been handled through an attorney named Broward, who operated in the particular space between Dante's legitimate business interests and the kind of institutional contacts that crime organizations maintained at careful distance for exactly these moments. Broward was not told everything. He was told enough. Enough to make a call, to have a conversation with a specific individual in a federal office on Center Street, to establish that certain events would be occurring at a specific location Friday evening, and that monitoring those events would be in multiple parties' interests. The attorney asked no questions about the specifics. He was well paid not to. "They'll have vehicles in the area," Dante told Talia. "They won't enter until they have enough on camera to make it worth entering. That means we need Lorenzo and Silas inside and talking before anyone moves." "How long?" Broward said minimum 8 minutes of usable audio and video capture. 8 minutes is a long time in a room that's about to go wrong, she said. "I know." "Lorenzo's going to bring armed people." "Yes." "And the people he brings won't know about the cameras." "No." "So they'll behave the way armed people behave when they think no one is watching." "That's the idea," Dante said. She looked at him. "And if one of them decides to move before 8 minutes is up," he met her eyes, "then we improvise." She had spent 6 years in the Marines being told to improvise and had generally found that improvisation worked better when you had prepared for it specifically, so she spent Thursday afternoon preparing for it specifically, walking the warehouse floor until she knew the distance between every structural column, until she knew which angles put her between Dante and the service corridor entrance, until she knew the freight elevator shaft's resonance and what it would sound like if someone came up it in the dark. Caruso had 4 people in the building, not in the main space, distributed. 2 on the second floor with sightlines to the stairwell. 1 in the loading dock area behind the dock doors. 1 at the exterior service door, who would allow entry and then fall back to a position where they couldn't be seen and couldn't be used as an obstacle. Talia's position was a structural alcove at the north end of the ground floor, 8 feet from where Dante would stand. Close enough to move. Far enough to look like empty space in the dark. She had asked for one additional thing, and Dante had provided it without asking why. A tactical vest, worn under a jacket, dark, the kind that distributed impact rather than stopping rounds. She wasn't expecting a firefight. She was expecting a confrontation that could go wrong in specific and limited ways. And she was dressing for the specific and limited ways rather than the general worst case. Because dressing for the general worst case told the body there was nothing it could do, and she needed her body to believe otherwise. Friday arrived. The way days arrive when you've been awake through the night before them, suddenly, without the organic transition of sleep dividing one date from another. Just the light changing outside the window of the Varick Street office where she had been working since 4 in the morning, the gray going, amber going, the particular flat white of a November day that had no intention of being beautiful about it. She called Marcus at 7. He answered immediately, which meant he hadn't slept either. "I'm fine," he said before she asked. "The apartment's fine. Caruso's guy downstairs is named Terrence, and he brought me a breakfast sandwich at 6, which I didn't ask for, but was not going to refuse." "Good," she said. "Tonight's the night?" "Tonight's the night." A pause. "You going to be okay?" "Yes," she said. "You sure?" "No," she said. "But yes." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Come back." "I will," she said. She put the phone down and picked up her coffee and drank it cold, because it had been cold for an hour and she had not noticed until now. At 9 in the morning, Dante called the floor together. 12 people. Caruso, Ellis, the 4 assigned to the warehouse, 2 additional security staff, Broward's contact relay, and 2 others whose roles she had learned but whose names she was still organizing into reliable memory. And Talia. Dante stood at the head of the table without notes. He laid out the operation. He did it in 11 minutes, precisely, without rhetoric, without the kind of pre-battle speech that existed in movies to make people feel something. He stated the objectives, the positions, the signals, the contingencies. He stated what each person's job was and what it was not. He stated once, without emphasis, that the goal of tonight was not violence but documentation, and that the secondary goal, in the event that documentation became insufficient, was that everyone in this room came home. When he finished, he looked around the table. "Questions," he said. Silas Vane was not at the table. That absence sat in the room like a presence. No one had questions. The day ground forward. At 2 in the afternoon, Ellis confirmed through a monitored communication channel that Lorenzo Benedetti had activated a logistics vehicle, a commercial van registered to a shell entity, and that the van had been loaded at a Benedetti-controlled property in Red Hook. He could not confirm what was in the van. He could confirm that the loading process had taken 40 minutes and that 4 individuals had been involved. 4 in the van, Caruso said. Probably another vehicle. Lorenzo doesn't travel without a second vehicle. Silas will be in the second vehicle, Talia said. She was looking at the map. He won't want to be caught in a van with whatever Lorenzo loaded. Deniability, Dante said. Positioning, she said. He wants to be able to move laterally if something goes wrong. He doesn't know about the cameras, but he knows about risk. Dante looked at her. You think he suspects? She considered it honestly. I think he knows something didn't go the way he expected when I didn't take the phone offer. He's been running intelligence operations for 2.5 years. He knows the variables. He won't be certain, but he'll be careful. Careful means he hangs back. Until he thinks it's safe to come in, she said, which means we may need to give him a reason to come in. Dante looked at her for a long moment. We can discuss that if it becomes necessary, he said. She nodded and went back to the map. At 6 in the evening, she went to the women's room on 13, the empty floor, the one that existed for misdirection, and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists for 30 seconds, which was a technique for regulating the nervous system that she had been taught and had used before operations and had never once discussed with anyone because it felt like the kind of thing that was only useful if you kept it private. She looked at her reflection. She looked like someone who had been awake for 36 hours and was about to do something irreversible. She dried her hands and went back upstairs. They arrived at the warehouse at 9:15. Dante's car first, lights off for the last 2 blocks. Then Caruso in a separate vehicle. Talia had ridden with Dante, which had been a practical decision about logistics and not something either of them examined beyond that. In the car, in the dark, for about 40 seconds while Fees navigated the last block before the warehouse lot, there had been silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that exists between people who have said the necessary things and don't need to fill the remaining space with anything. Then Dante had said quietly, "If something goes wrong in there tonight, not procedurally wrong, genuinely wrong, it won't," she said, "but if it does." She looked at him in the dark of the car. His profile, the set of his jaw, the particular stillness of a man who had decided to walk into a building without a weapon and was not going to revisit that decision. "Then I handle it," she said. "That's the job." He looked at her. "That's not what I was going to say." "I know," she said, "but it's the true answer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If something goes wrong, I need you to prioritize getting yourself out. Not me. Yourself." She looked at him. "I'm serious," he said. "I know you are," she said. She did not agree to it. The car stopped. They went in. The warehouse in the dark was a different building than it was in daylight. The smell changed. Concrete and hydraulic fluid and the faint chemical trace of whatever had last moved through the storage areas. The ceiling disappeared into shadow 4 stories up. The structural columns cast angled shadows across the floor from the one work light left burning on the south wall, which was there by design. Just enough light to see by, not enough to illuminate corners. Talia went to her position in the alcove. Dante went to his position at the center of the floor. She watched him walk across the concrete and take his stance. Not aggressive, not defensive, just present, hands at his sides, facing the service corridor door at the east end. And she thought that it took a specific kind of person to walk into a room like this and stand in the middle of it like they owned it without a single visible concession to fear. She did not know if that was courage or discipline or the particular recklessness of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room for long enough that his body had stopped producing the normal warning signals. She positioned herself in the alcove and made herself invisible, which was a practiced skill rather than a natural one. Controlling the breath, reducing the body's habitual small movements, the micro-adjustments and shifts that humans performed unconsciously, and that were invisible in normal environments and visible as noise in very quiet ones. She checked her watch. 9:41. Caruso's voice came through the single earpiece she was wearing, barely above a whisper. "Vehicle in the lot. The van. Second vehicle is a black SUV, parked at the street. Silas in the SUV, waiting." "Copy," she said, so quiet it was almost just breath. Then, "Service door." She heard it. The sound of the exterior mechanism, the specific clunk of the secondary lock being disengaged from outside, which meant whoever was on the other side had either a key or the specific knowledge of how to defeat that lock, which narrowed it to someone who had been given interior access detail by Silas. The door opened, light from outside, briefly, a sliver of the lot's ambient glow, and then the figures coming through it, and then the door closing behind them, and the warehouse returning to its controlled dark. 4 of them, moving with the careful efficiency of people who had done building entry before and were not nervous about it so much as professionally focused. She counted them without moving anything except her eyes, left to right, sizes, the particular gait patterns that told you things about training and about whether someone expected resistance. The one in front was carrying something low at his side. She didn't need to see it clearly. Then, Lorenzo Benedetti. She recognized him from the photographs Ellis had pulled. 50s, compact, the kind of build that had once been athletic and had thickened without entirely losing the underlying structure. He dressed like a businessman rather than what he was, which was either self-deception or very good practice. And his face in the low light of the warehouse was composed with the expression of a man who had come to collect something he believed was already owed to him. He walked in and saw Dante. He stopped. His people spread slightly. Not dramatically, just the natural readjustment of a group that had expected an empty room and found a person in it. Lorenzo looked at Dante for a long moment. Then he said, "I was told you'd be in Boston." "I was told the same thing," Dante said. His voice carried in the warehouse without effort, the particular acoustic quality of the space amplifying it just enough. "Turns out neither of us is in Boston." Lorenzo's jaw moved. A small recalibration, not fear, something more controlled than fear. The adjustment of a man reordering his understanding of a situation without showing that he was doing it. "You look comfortable," Lorenzo said. "I'm in my own building," Dante said. Talia's breathing was slow and even. She counted the 4 men and tracked their positions in her peripheral vision without moving her head. 2 had settled into a loose coverage pattern, east and west of Lorenzo, which was protective positioning. 1 had moved toward the freight elevator, which was either curiosity or a flanking instinct. The 4th stayed near the door. The one near the door was the problem. She had identified him in the first 20 seconds as the most experienced in the room. It was in the way he stood, weight distributed, nothing wasted, eyes moving in a pattern, rather than reacting to whatever was loudest. She filed him as the primary concern and kept the others in her periphery. "You've caused me a significant amount of difficulty," Lorenzo said to Dante. He said it conversationally, as though discussing a business dispute. "You know that." "I've caused you difficulty," Dante said. "Walk me through how." "Your waterfront arrangements conflict with expansions I've been planning for 2 years. Lorenzo's voice was patient. The voice of a man who had prepared this conversation and was delivering the prepared version. "I've been very measured in how I've approached this. I've given you opportunities to restructure voluntarily." "Through Silas," Dante said. Lorenzo's eyes moved, just slightly. "Through a mutual associate," he said. "Who is outside in an SUV right now," Dante said, "because he doesn't want to be seen in this building." Lorenzo said nothing. Talia checked her watch without moving her wrist. She had positioned it so she could read it from the corner of her eye. 9:53. 12 minutes since the door opened. They needed the conversation to keep going. "I want to understand something," Dante said. "You've been building a case for taking my operations for 2.5 years. You've been patient. You've been systematic. You've used someone I trusted to do it." He paused. "So why is tonight the night? What changed?" Lorenzo looked at him. "You brought in someone I didn't know." Talia felt the specific quality of attention shift in the room. "The woman," Lorenzo said, "from the restaurant." He said it with the deliberate calm of someone laying down a card they've been holding. "I don't like variables I haven't assessed. You brought in a variable on Monday, and by Thursday my contact in your organization was gone." He tilted his head. "That's not coincidence." "No," Dante agreed. "It's not." "So here we are," Lorenzo said. "Here we are," Dante said. 9:57. Broward had said 8 minutes of usable capture. They had been going for 16. She didn't know exactly what the threshold was for the federal vehicles outside to move, but she understood that there was human judgment involved, and human judgment was slower than she would have preferred. Then the man by the freight elevator moved. Not dramatically, 2 steps, just enough to change his angle to the room, and in doing so, put himself between Dante and the service corridor door in a way that could have been accidental and was not. She measured the geometry. She was 8 feet from Dante. The man near the elevator was now 14 feet from Dante on the opposite angle. The 2 coverage men were holding position. The man near the door had not moved. Lorenzo was still talking. She registered the words without fully allocating attention to them. A conversation about territorial arrangements and the inevitability of structural change. And Dante was listening with the expression of a man who was not listening, which meant he had also registered the elevator man's movement and was tracking the same geometry she was. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. She gave him the smallest possible movement of her head, 1 millimeter to the right. He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly to the left. It was the kind of communication that required either years of partnership or a shared operational language so fundamental it didn't need to be trained between specific people. She didn't examine which of those it was. Then Silas walked in. The service door opened, and she knew before she saw his face because she knew the shoulder pattern, that right shoulder, 1/2 inch high, the stress tell she had read on Monday in the operational center. And she tracked him across the room with her eyes and felt every calculation she had been running update simultaneously. He had come in. He had decided the risk of staying in the SUV was higher than the risk of being in the room, which meant he had calculated that Dante was in a position of weakness, and that this was the moment to formalize it. He was wrong. He walked to Lorenzo's side and looked at Dante with an expression that contained something she hadn't expected to see there. Relief. Not triumph. Relief. The expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was finally in a position where he didn't have to pretend anymore. That told her something. It told her the betrayal had not been comfortable for Silas. It had been a decision made in a specific moment 2.5 years ago that had then required an escalating series of smaller decisions to sustain, and the weight of that accumulation was visible on his face now that the performance was over. She filed it away. "Silas," Dante said. "Dante." His voice was level. "I know how this looks. Tell me how it looks." "It looks like betrayal," Silas said. "I'd rather call it a correction." He glanced at Lorenzo briefly, then back. "You've been steering this organization toward legitimacy for 3 years, dismantling what your father built, giving up territory, giving up influence, giving up revenue streams because you decided your conscience needed a cleaner environment." He stopped. "Some of us didn't agree with that direction. You could have said that to me," Dante said. "I did say it to you," Silas said. "In 2022. You remember that conversation?" A beat. "I remember," Dante said. "You listened to everything I said, and then you told me the decision was made." Silas's voice tightened slightly. Not all the way to anger, adjacent to it, the residue of something that had been anger once and had compressed itself into something harder over time. "So I made my own decision." "With Lorenzo's money," Dante said. "With the resources available," Silas said. Talia was measuring everything in the room simultaneously. Positions, angles, the weight distribution of the men she'd been tracking, the particular quality of attention that preceded physical movement. The man by the freight elevator had gone very still. Still was sometimes safer than moving. Sometimes it was the opposite. Lorenzo put his hand in his coat pocket. She moved. Not the full distance. 3 steps out of the alcove. Enough to be visible. Enough to change the geometry of the room in a way that Lorenzo's hand registered as information before it completed whatever it had started. He stopped. Everyone in the room stopped. She was standing in the partial light at the edge of the work light's reach, and for a moment the warehouse held the particular suspension of a space in which every person present has just recalculated everything simultaneously. Lorenzo looked at her. "You're the variable," he said. "I'm the security director," she said. Her voice came out flat and steady, and she was aware of every person in the room as a set of angles and distances and potential trajectories. "Keep your hand where it is." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. The man near the door took a step. "Don't," Caruso said. He had come in from the loading dock, and he was not alone. 2 of the warehouse team with him, positioned at the dock entrance, and the communication in their posture was clear even in the low light. The room recalculated again. Lorenzo looked from Caruso to Talia to Dante, and the expression on his face moved through several things quickly. Anger, assessment, something that might have been the beginning of a revised understanding of the situation. "You were ready," he said to Dante. "I've been ready since Tuesday," Dante said. Silas turned toward the service door. Talia was already moving. She crossed the distance in 4 steps. Not running, driving, the difference being that running gave the impression of desperation and driving gave the impression of inevitability, and she needed the second one. And she got her hand on his arm at the shoulder before he reached the door, and he turned and swung, and she took the swing on her forearm and felt it up to her shoulder and used the momentum to put him off balance and drove him sideways into the wall. He hit the wall with enough force to knock his breath loose. She had her knee in his lower back and his arm bent behind him before he could fully reinflate. "Stay down," she said. Her own breathing was elevated. She could feel it, could feel the specific burn in the forearm where he'd connected, would feel that tomorrow in a way she wouldn't like. But her voice came out level. He stayed down. Behind her, she heard Lorenzo's voice. "This is not," and then a different voice, not from inside the warehouse, outside the service door, multiple voices, the specific declarative shorthand of federal identification. And then the exterior doors came open, front and side simultaneously, and the quality of the darkness in the warehouse changed entirely as lights came through every entrance at once. And the voices were clear and directive, and the room became something different in the space of about 4 seconds. Not a Benedetti operation, not a Marcelli facility, but a federal evidence collection site, which was what it had been designed to be for the past 48 hours. Talia kept her knee in Silas's back. He had stopped trying to move. He was breathing against the concrete floor in the particular rhythm of a person whose body is processing the end of something that has been going on for a very long time. And she had been in enough combat situations to know that the end of sustained effort sometimes felt more like collapse than relief. "It's over," she said. He didn't answer. Across the floor, Lorenzo was being separated from his people with the efficient impersonality of federal procedure. His face had settled into an expression she recognized from the restaurant, the expression of a man rearranging the story in his head while the actual story finalized itself around him. She looked for Dante. He was where she had last seen him, center of the floor, standing exactly where he had been standing since they walked in, watching the process unfold with the stillness of a man who had put something enormous in motion and was now watching it move. Then the man by the freight elevator, the one she had marked as the primary concern from the moment he walked in, made his move. He had been waiting. She understood that in retrospect, and understood it in the same instant she registered the movement, which was precise and directed and aimed not at the federal agents flooding the room, but at the one target that wasn't surrounded, the one figure still standing unprotected in the center of the floor. She was already moving before the full picture assembled. 15 feet. She had 14 feet to cover in the time it took him to close 4. She did not close all of it. She got between them. Not cleanly, not the way she would have drawn it up. And his arm came around and the weapon discharged once in the direction of the ceiling as she redirected his wrist. A report that was enormous in the enclosed space, and then suddenly very far away as her hearing compressed. And then his elbow found her ribs, and she felt it in a way that she would examine later with considerably more concern than she currently had time for. She held the wrist. She did not let it rotate toward the floor. It would have rotated toward Dante. Then Dante was there. He came across the room and his hand closed over the weapon and he wrenched it aside and something went wrong with the man's wrist in a way that produced a sound she filed without reacting to. And then the man was on the floor with 2 federal agents on top of him, and the weapon was in Dante's hand and then immediately out of it, placed on the concrete carefully and deliberately, because Dante understood cameras. She became aware that she was holding her side. She became aware that Dante was looking at her. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her hand against her ribs. "You're not," he said. "I'm functional," she said. "That's what I said." He looked at her for a moment. That look again. The one she didn't have a category for yet. And then he reached out and put his hand on her shoulder, not grabbing, just placing it there, a brief and specific contact, and she was aware of exactly how much of the past 4 days was compressed into it. The warehouse was full of people now, light and voices and the mechanical procedure of arrests being processed, evidence being cataloged. Lorenzo stood with his wrists behind his back looking at the floor. Silas was being walked toward the dock entrance by 2 agents, and he turned once and looked back at Dante across the length of the warehouse floor. And the look on his face was not hatred, and was not remorse, and was not quite either of the things she had expected. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who had understood, finally and too late, that he had misread the person he thought he knew. Dante looked back at him without expression. Silas turned away. The federal team lead approached Dante, a woman, late 40s, jacket, with the particular fit of someone who wore body armor regularly and had shaped her clothing choices around it, and spoke to him in the specific tones of a professional interaction that would generate many more professional interactions over the coming weeks and months. Talia stood with her hand on her ribs and watched the room and did an inventory of what was hurting and what was functional and what would need attention and in what order. And somewhere in the middle of that inventory, she became aware that the thing she had been running on for the past 72 hours, the cold, forward-moving energy that had kept her functional on no sleep through planning and positioning, and the particular sustained focus of waiting for something bad to happen, was beginning to metabolize into something else. Not relief yet. Too soon for relief. But the beginning of the space that would eventually become relief, once enough time had passed, and enough things had been verified. And Marcus was back in his own apartment, and the physical therapist had been scheduled, and the insurance situation had been addressed, and 100 other things that waited patiently on the other side of tonight. For right now, there was just the warehouse and the lights and the sound of proceedings being conducted, and her ribs telling her something she wasn't ready to fully hear yet. Dante finished with the federal team lead and crossed back to where Talia stood. "They need statements," he said. "I know," she said. "Caruso can take you to the hospital first." "Statement first," she said. He looked at her ribs. "Statement first," she said again. He was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said. She looked at him. "You were exactly what I thought you were," he said. "In the restaurant, before I knew anything else about you." He paused. "I just want you to know that. She looked at him for a long moment in the light of a warehouse that had just changed everything for both of them in ways they would still be discovering for a long time, and she said, "I know," she said. "I was watching you too." The hospital was a place she had been trying to avoid thinking about for approximately 4 hours, and when she finally walked into the emergency room at NYU Langone at 2:17 in the morning with Caruso beside her and her hand still pressed against her right side, the triage nurse looked at her with the professional assessment of someone who had seen people arrive at this particular hour in this particular condition more times than could be counted, and had developed an economy of both movement and sympathy around it. "How long ago?" the nurse said. 4 hours, Talia said. The nurse looked at her hand. "You've been walking around with it for 4 hours. "I had things to finish." The nurse wrote something on her intake form that Talia suspected was not medically technical. 2 ribs. That was the verdict, delivered by a doctor named Okafor, who had the particular bedside manner of someone who had been on shift for 11 hours and had arrived at a pure relationship with fact as a result. Not broken, cracked, which was a distinction that mattered medically and did not matter practically since the treatment was the same either way. Compression wrap, pain management, the specific indignity of being told to rest by a person who had no framework for what her life actually required. She sat in the curtained bay with the wrap tight around her midsection and her jacket back on over it, and thought about the man by the freight elevator and the specific angle of his elbow, and how a half-inch either direction would have changed the conversation she was having with herself right now into something considerably shorter. Caruso was in the waiting area. He had offered to stay and she had told him to go out, which he had done without argument, which told her something about how far they had come in the space of 1 week. Her phone was in her hand. She called Marcus at 2:31. He answered before the first ring completed, which told her he had been sitting with the phone. "It's done," she said. A silence that had nothing empty in it. "You okay?" he said. "2 cracked ribs," she said. "I'm at Langone." "Talia, I'm sitting up and talking and the doctor used the word manageable 3 times," she said. "I'm okay." She heard him breathe, the specific quality of it, the release in it. "Come get me in the morning," she said. "I'll send you the address for the place Caruso set up. We'll get breakfast." "Yeah," he said. His voice had gone rough in the way voices went rough when the thing you had been afraid of didn't happen, and your body was processing the relief as though it were its own kind of grief. "Yeah, okay, breakfast." She sat in the curtained bay for another hour while the paperwork completed itself. At some point, she realized she was looking at the ceiling and not thinking about anything specific, which was the first time in 6 days that had been true, and she let it be true for as long as it lasted. The federal process began the following Monday and continued for 6 weeks. She gave her statement 3 times, once in the warehouse, in the immediate aftermath, when everything was still acute and she was running on the chemical residue of sustained adrenaline, and the statement reflected that, which Broward's colleague told her later was actually useful because acute statements had an authenticity that polished ones didn't. Once 4 days later, in a federal building on Foley Square, in a room with gray walls and a table that seemed to have been purchased specifically to be the least interesting table that had ever existed. And once more, 3 weeks in, when additional questions had accumulated around the specifics of what she had observed in the conference room the previous Monday regarding the Benedetti representative's response to the service corridor information. She answered all of it accurately and completely. The accuracy was important to her, not because she was afraid of the alternative, but because the alternative required a management of narrative that she had no interest in sustaining. She had seen what sustained narrative management did to a person. She had spent a week watching it on Silas Vane's right shoulder. Dante gave his statements separately, in different rooms, on different schedules. She saw him twice during the 6 weeks, once in the Varick Street building when she went to collect personal items and review security protocol updates with the remaining staff, and once outside the federal building on Foley Square, when their respective appointments had ended in proximity and they were both standing on the sidewalk in December cold, waiting for their respective transportation. On that occasion, he had looked at her for a moment and said, "How are the ribs?" "Healing," she said. He nodded. He looked at the street. "Ellis has been managing the transition documents. The restructuring is moving faster than I expected." "That's good," she said. "I'd like you involved in the security architecture for the new structure." He paused. "When you're ready. Not as a request tied to anything else, separately." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was still watching the street, his breath visible in the cold air, his jacket inadequate for the temperature, in a way that suggested he had come from inside and hadn't expected to be standing on a sidewalk. "I'll think about it," she said. He looked at her then. The look that she had been trying to find a category for since the first time she'd seen it in the restaurant, in the dim corner booth, in the moment after she'd put Gavin Rusk on the floor and turned around and found it directed at her. She had a category for it now. It had taken her most of 6 weeks to build it. It was the look of a man who was not accustomed to encountering things he hadn't anticipated and was still recalibrating to the fact that she was one of them. His car arrived. He got in. He did not say goodbye, which she had noticed he never did. He ended conversations by moving to the next thing, which she had initially read as curtness and now understood was a characteristic, the same way she ended phone calls without preamble. She stood on the sidewalk for another 3 minutes until her own car came. The Benedetti proceedings moved through the federal system with the particular grinding momentum of organized crime cases built on recorded evidence, slow, certain, and ultimately inescapable. Lorenzo's attorneys filed 4 separate motions in the first 2 weeks, each of which was reviewed and addressed and did not alter the trajectory of the case because the evidence was not interpretive. It was Lorenzo's voice in Lorenzo's building's recording, discussing specifics that had no innocent construction. Silas Vane entered a negotiated agreement in the 5th week. The specifics of what he provided were not disclosed to Talia directly, but Broward's contact told Dante, and Dante told her in a text message that was 4 sentences long and characteristically spare. Silas had given them 3 additional Benedetti operations in exchange for a sentencing consideration that reduced his exposure significantly without eliminating it. He would serve time. The amount had not yet been determined. She read the text in the physical therapy waiting room where she sat with Marcus on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and she sat with it for a moment. Then Marcus came out from his session, and she put the phone away. He was moving better. The therapist, a woman named Reinhold, who had the practical compassion of someone who had spent 15 years helping bodies learn to do things they had forgotten how to do, had been adjusting his program for the past month, and the adjustments were producing results that Marcus reported with the same even steadiness he brought to everything, not performing gratitude, not performing struggle, just reporting fact. He could walk 20 feet without the frame now, 40 on a good day. On the Tuesday in the 5th week, he walked from the therapy room to the waiting area, 32 feet, she counted, using only the wall for occasional balance, and he sat down in the chair next to her with the particular careful landing of someone managing their relationship with gravity. And he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Marcus said, 40 next week. 40 next week, she agreed. She paid the session fee at the desk on the way out. The amount was what it had always been, and she paid it from her salary without supplementing it with anything else, which had been her condition from the beginning and which Dante had accepted without pushing. Gavin Rusk's case moved through a different system. The video evidence had come from 4 sources: 2 phone cameras from customers at Carmine's who had been recording before the incident began and continued through it, 1 from the restaurant's own security system, which the manager had initially been reluctant to provide and had eventually provided after a conversation with someone Talia was not aware of and did not ask about, and 1 from the external camera of a business across the street that had captured the awning interaction in its periphery. The combined footage left nothing ambiguous. His attorney attempted 2 lines of argument in the first week, both of which were visible as what they were to anyone who reviewed the video with functioning eyesight, and the case moved toward resolution with less resistance than his money should have allowed him to generate. Talia suspected there were factors in that acceleration she didn't have full visibility into, and she made a deliberate choice not to inquire about them. She had her own relationship with the justice system now, carved out of 6 weeks of federal depositions, and she understood it as a mechanism that was neither reliable nor irrelevant, but was the available structure, and working within it produced better outcomes than circumventing it, which was a conclusion she had reached through experience rather than philosophy. The conviction came on a Wednesday. She got a call from a number she didn't recognize, and when she answered, it was a woman from the DA's office with a flat, informative voice who told her the verdict and the sentencing range and gave her a case number for her records. Talia thanked her and ended the call. She was standing in the kitchen of her Brooklyn apartment. It was 3 in the afternoon, and the light through the window was the low gold of December, and Marcus was in his room listening to something she could hear through the wall. She put the phone down on the counter. She stood there for a moment. Then she started making coffee. The restructuring of Dante's holdings took 3 months to complete in its first phase and would continue for longer than that in its secondary iterations. But the essential architecture was established by February. The restaurants, the security company, the real estate portfolio, and the shipping interests consolidated under a single corporate entity, with legitimate governance structures and audited financials, and a board that included 3 people with no prior connection to the Marcelli family. The criminal operations were not transferred or concealed or renamed. They were ended. Not all of them on the same day, and not all of them without complications. And the complications were handled with the same careful, strategic patience that had characterized Dante's management of the organization from the beginning. No announcement, no dramatic gesture, just the steady withdrawal of infrastructure until the things that had existed in shadow no longer had shadow sufficient to exist in. She was involved in the security architecture for the new entity from January. She had told him she would think about it, and she had thought about it, and the conclusion she arrived at was that the work was real, and the structure being built was real, and she was better equipped than almost anyone else available to design the security framework for an organization whose founder understood threat assessment and whose history required a security team that could operate without illusions about what people were capable of. She was also, she admitted to herself during the drive back from her first day of the new arrangement, interested in seeing how it developed, not just professionally. She did not examine that admission too closely in January. By March, she was examining it slightly more closely, and by March, she and Dante had also had 3 conversations that had nothing to do with security architecture and everything to do with the particular territory that exists between people who have been through something together and are now navigating what comes after. The conversations were not smooth. She was not a smooth conversationalist, and he was not a man who had practice at conversations where the power structure was genuinely level, and they made each other uncomfortable in productive ways. The kind of discomfort that came from being seen accurately rather than the kind that came from being dismissed. He told her, in February, about the argument with Silas in 2022 that Silas had referenced in the warehouse. She had been thinking about that detail since the night it surfaced, filing it in the category of things she needed more context for. They were in the office on Varick Street, late evening, the floor empty except for the 2 of them, and Caruso somewhere down the hall. Dante was reviewing a document, and she was going over the security protocol updates she'd drafted, and neither of them was fully focused on their respective materials. He said, "Silas told me in 2022 that the direction I was taking the organization would eventually create enemies. I couldn't manage the way I'd managed the ones my father made. He said that cleaning something up didn't make you safe. It made you visible." She looked up. "He wasn't entirely wrong," Dante said. He set the document down. "The Benedetti problem was worse because I was visible, because I'd been building something that had real value and people with less patience than me wanted to take it." "But he was wrong about the conclusion," she said. "Yes," he said. "He thought visibility meant vulnerability. I think it means accountability." He paused. "When you're doing something you'd have to hide, you hide. When you're doing something you don't have to hide, you stop hiding. And stopping hiding is—" He stopped. "Uncomfortable," she said. "Exposing," he said. She looked at him. "But it's the correct direction," he said. She looked back at her documents. "Yes," she said. "It is." The evening at Carmine's happened in April. She did not suggest it, and he did not announce it as a plan. He mentioned, in a phone call that had ostensibly been about a security protocol amendment, that he had been considering returning to the restaurant, and she had been quiet for a moment and then said that she had been thinking the same thing, and the thinking the same thing had resolved itself into an arrangement without either of them using the word arrangement. They took a car to Little Italy on a Thursday evening when the rain was doing something between drizzle and actual rain that the weather service had apparently declined to classify. The restaurant was warm and lit the same way it had always been lit. The wine bottles, the photographs, the smell of garlic and old plaster that was probably structural at this point. The manager saw her come in. He was a man named Del Russo, who was in his 60s and had been running Carmine's for 22 years, and who had the particular relationship with his own culpability that people developed when they had done something they knew was wrong and had been given more time than they deserved to sit with it. He came to them at the door. He did not extend his hand because the situation did not call for that, and he knew it. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Del Russo," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man composing something he had rehearsed and was now discovering that the rehearsed version was insufficient. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You do," she said. "What happened?" "The way I handled it. I've thought about it." He stopped. "I needed to keep the customer. I told myself there was nothing I could do. That was not—" He stopped again. "It wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right, and I did it anyway." She looked at him. "I know what you're owed doesn't have a clean exchange rate," she said, "but I appreciate you saying it." He nodded. He did not push for absolution, which she appreciated. He showed them to a table, not the corner booth, a different one, near the window, and he said quietly that their dinner was on the house, and she was about to decline it, and then she didn't. Because the gesture was real, even if it was insufficient, and she was tired of declining things that were real. They sat. The shattered table from November had been replaced. The new one matched the others, and she would not have been able to identify it, except that she had been in this room when it happened, and her memory of the room included its absence. Dante ordered the linguine. She ordered something she hadn't tried before, which was a deliberate choice. She was tired of ordering things she already knew. They talked, not about the organization, and not about the restructuring, and not about the federal proceedings, or the security architecture, or any of the things that had structured their interactions for the past 5 months. They talked about his father, which was a subject he brought up himself in a way she hadn't expected, not with the management she'd have predicted, but with the actual complicated texture of a son who had grown up in the long shadow of a man whose power and whose methods had shaped everything around him, and who was now in the ongoing process of deciding which parts of that inheritance to keep and which to set down. His father was alive and in a care facility in New Jersey, and had not fully recovered his speech after the stroke. Dante visited on Sundays. He told her this with the flatness of a fact that had been lived with long enough to stop being raw, but hadn't entirely stopped being something. She told him about the convoy, the ambush, the 4 seconds, the decision she'd made and the result she'd lived with since. She told him about the 18 months after, the protected officials who treated her and the people she served with as instruments rather than people, the specific erosion of that. The morning she woke up and understood that she was done. He listened the way he listened to everything, with complete attention, not filling the space, not moving to make her feel better about things that didn't feel better. "You made the right call," he said when she finished. "In the convoy." "I know," she said, "but knowing and being at peace with it are different things." "Yes," she said. "I'm familiar with that particular gap," he said. She looked at him. They ate. The food was good. It had always been good. She had always known it was good. That had never been the issue. And the restaurant made noise around them the way it made noise in November, the ordinary, pleasant noise of people eating and talking and existing in proximity. And she sat inside it and felt something she had not been able to name for a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Something more specific than happiness. The feeling of being exactly where she was, in a room she recognized, at a table she had chosen, with a person whose presence was complicated and known, and not asking her to be anything other than the version of herself that had walked into this restaurant in November and responded to an injury with 6 years of accumulated discipline. The manager came by once. He did not hover. He asked if everything was satisfactory in the way that people ask when they mean something beyond the food. And she said yes. And she meant something beyond the food. After, they stood under the awning. The rain had stopped somewhere between the linguine and the dessert neither of them had ordered. The street was wet and lit the way November had been wet and lit, but the temperature was different. April had a particular quality of cold that acknowledged spring was coming rather than denying it. And Manhattan was doing the thing Manhattan did at night, which was to be exactly as loud and lit and indifferent to individual human experience as it always was, which was, she had come to understand, a kind of honesty. Dante was looking at the street. She was looking at the street. "I gave you a card on this sidewalk," he said. "You did," she said. "You didn't take it right away." "I looked at it first," she said. "I noticed," he said. She glanced at him. You notice everything. So do you, he said. She looked back at the street. A cab went past, its occupied light off. Two people walking a combined three dogs that were having independent opinions about direction. A man eating something from a paper bag on the steps of a building across the way, not looking at anything, just eating. When I came back to the organization, she said, it wasn't because I ran out of options. He looked at her. I had options, she said. By the time I called you that morning, the overnight security positions I'd applied for, two of them had come back. One was decent money. She paused. I called you because I thought what you were trying to build was real, and I wanted to see if real things were still possible. He was quiet for a moment. Are they? He said. She thought about Marcus walking 40 feet. She thought about cracked ribs and a conviction and a federal case moving through its process, and a restructuring that was taking shape into something that didn't require hiding. She thought about a conversation in an office on Varick Street about visibility and accountability and the correct direction even when the correct direction was exposing. So far, she said. He looked at her. It was not the smile from November, the one in the restaurant, slow and private, the smile of a man who had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. This was quieter than that, more worn in. The expression of a man who had spent 5 months learning that the thing he'd found was real in ways that were more complex and more requiring and more worthwhile than what he could have assessed from a corner booth at 9 in the evening. What you said in the warehouse, he said. After the shooting. He paused. You said you were watching me too, in the restaurant. I was, she said. What were you watching for? She considered it honestly. Whether you meant it, she said. The card, the offer. Whether it was something you said or something you actually intended. She paused. People in positions like yours, I'd spent years watching people say things they didn't intend. It becomes a habit of attention. And, he said. And you meant it, she said. I could tell you meant it. That was the problem. Why was that a problem? She looked at him. Because it made it harder to say no. It was quiet for a moment. You didn't say no, he said. No, she said. I didn't. A pause. I'm glad you didn't, he said. She looked at the street. I know, she said. They stood under the awning for another moment without speaking, and the city continued its indifferent efficiency around them, and she was aware of the physical proximity of him, the warmth of it in the April cold, the fact that they were both looking at the same street from the same angle without either of them moving to leave. Then she said, Marcus has a session Thursday morning. His therapist thinks he'll be off the frame entirely by summer. That's significant, he said. It is, she said. What does he want to do? Dante said. After, when he's mobile. She hadn't expected the question. She had been so focused on the framework of getting to that point that the question of what existed beyond it had not fully occupied her. He wants to work with his hands, she said. He was studying construction management before the accident. He wants to go back to it. I have a development project starting in the fall, Dante said. Not with weight on it, matter of fact. Real construction, not a front. I could use someone who knows the discipline from the inside and isn't compromised by the organization's history. She looked at him. That's not charity, he said, reading her expression. I'm aware of how it sounds, and it isn't. I have a genuine need. He'd be qualified once he finishes the program, if the timing works. She studied him. You researched his field. I was aware of it already, he said, from the background. She remembered. The background, 10 days before the restaurant, the database, the file with Marcus's name and address that had ended up in Silas's export and in Lorenzo's possession. The chain of consequence from that single decision had run through the entire 5 months. I'll tell him, she said. He decides. Of course, Dante said. She looked at him for a moment. You're different than I thought you were going to be, she said. Is that good? It's accurate, she said. He accepted that. She put her hands in her jacket pockets. The April air was clean in the way that air was clean after rain, and the street was beginning to go quieter now that the restaurant hour was winding down, the city shifting into its later register. Fewer people, faster pace, everyone headed somewhere specific. I'm going to take the subway, she said. I know, he said. He didn't offer the car. He understood, she thought, that the subway was not about practicality. It was about the return to ordinary movement, the ordinary city, the ordinary negotiation with distance that had been her life before November and was her life now, and was, in its way, the proof that the thing she had built back in the past 5 months was genuinely hers. Not protection, not the organization's infrastructure, but her own navigated territory. She stepped out from under the awning. The sidewalk was wet and reflected the restaurant light back in long orange streaks. She turned and looked at him once. I was standing at the edge of the awning with his hands in his coat pockets, watching her, and his expression was what it was. The thing she had spent 5 months trying to find a category for and had eventually accepted did not need one. Thursday, she said. The Security Amendment Review. Thursday, he said. She turned and walked toward the subway. The stairs down were wet and the platform smelled like every subway platform in New York. Metal and old air and the specific anonymous humanity of 10 million people passing through the same spaces. And she went through the turnstile and stood on the platform and waited. The train came. She sat by the door the way she always sat, with the exits visible and her bag in her lap and her peripheral vision covering the car. Old training that would never fully stop running, and she looked at the dark window and her reflection in it and thought about nothing specific for a while. She thought about the restaurant in November and the restaurant in April and the distance between them. She thought about Marcus walking 40 feet. She thought about what Caruso had said in the car on the bridge. Until tonight you were doing a job. Now you're doing something else. And she thought that he had been right, and that the something else had turned out to be larger and more requiring and more permanent than she could have mapped from the inside of that night. She got off at her stop. She walked the 4 blocks to her building in the April night, and the street was familiar under her feet, every crack and gutter and corner she had navigated for the 11 months before November, and was still navigating now, and she went up the stairs and put her key in the lock and let herself in. Marcus's light was on under his door. She knocked. "Yeah," he said. She pushed the door open. He was in bed with his phone, watching something on the small screen that he tilted away when she came in. A reflex from childhood that she had never told him she found endearing. "How was it?" he said. She leaned against the doorframe. "Good," she said. He looked at her face. He had always been able to read her face, even when she was doing her best to be unreadable, which she suspected was a sibling thing. The knowledge built from enough shared years to see through the management. "Just good," he said. She looked at him. 23 years old, her brother, the person she had restructured the entire past 5 months around keeping safe, sitting in his bed in their apartment with 40 feet of unassisted walking behind him and the summer ahead. "Better than good," she said. He nodded. She looked at him for a moment. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too," he said. She pulled his door mostly closed and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the window. Manhattan outside. The specific frequency of it. Sirens somewhere distant. A conversation from the street below. The ambient mechanical hum that never fully stopped. The city existing at 300 cycles a second, regardless of what had happened or been survived or was still in the process of becoming something. She pulled her jacket off. She lay back. She did not think about November or February, or the warehouse or the federal proceedings, or the ribs that still reminded her of their existence on certain movements. She thought about Thursday, the Security Amendment Review and the work it represented, and the organization being built into something that didn't require the things it used to require, and the slow, unglamorous, honest daily process of that, which was not a story with a clean ending, but was the only kind of story she had ever trusted. She thought about Dante standing at the edge of the awning. She thought about what better than good meant and decided she did not need to finish the thought tonight. Outside, Manhattan kept going. She closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she was asleep before she expected to be.